Now, the next piece is fairly lengthy, and I need to thank Ella from Holland for this piece, but this is a full-on report of what's going on in the Yellow Vest movement, and this comes from Amnesty International, and it's a fairly devastating report on police violence and French policy during the Yellow Vest demonstrations, which I'm pleased to say are still ongoing. And the Human Rights Organization demands that the use of war weapons such as the LBD-40 rifles and the GLI-F4 tear gas shells must be stopped immediately. You know, this should have a national outcry. Trump should chime in on this. In fact, every leader should. In fact, people all over the world should. Just because it's happening to somebody else doesn't mean it shouldn't involve you also. Now, these weapons have already led to fairly serious injuries, mutilations, amputations and disabilities in countless French people. Now, the LBD-40 weapon is used, contrary to regulations, to disperse the crowd of demonstrators. Now, the use is also disproportionate to the need to use the weapon, and according to the regulations it should only be used against people who commit violence against others. They're not committing violence, so they shouldn't be used at all. And where is the French government in this? Now, during the demonstrations, the LBD-40 bullets were fired at the crowd. Were they all fighting? Clearly not. Injuring many innocent demonstrators and bystanders. In addition, the shots were aimed at the head and fired from close by, which often leads to more serious injuries than when the instructions are observed. Now, according to Amnesty International, 23 people have now lost the sight of one eye or the entire eye because of being hit by rubber LBD bullets. 5 people have lost a hand or a foot, reportedly due to the GLI-F4 tear gas grenades, and civilian units are untrained and the main cause of injury. It also seems that the police units that are not trained in this specific form of law enforcement have used these weapons en masse, and the French ombudsman emphasises that one of the problems arises from the use of this weapon by law enforcement and civilian units that are not specifically trained for enforcement during demonstrations. Now, in particular, units such as the BAC and the CSI are associated with increasing risk of demonstrators being injured. Now, this is due to a random or disproportionate use of weapons, and according to official statistics, around 85% of the 3,460 rubber bullets used during the Yellow Vest demonstrations were indeed fired by law enforcement units that have not been trained to hold demonstrations. Mercenaries, in other words. And the main points in the Amnesty International report, they urge the authorities to suspend the use of the GLI-F4 tear gas shells and also the use of the LBD-40 guns during law enforcement operations. It urges law enforcement officials to review their police strategies to get out of the escalating situation. It appeals to the Minister of Interior to immediately ban weapons that do not comply with the principles of necessity and proportionality and requirements under French and international law. Point 4. Kinetic impact projectiles such as the LBD-40 bullets can cause serious injuries, especially when aimed at the head, face and upper body, and to comply with the principles of necessity and proportionality. and in general respect for the right to life and personal integrity. Now, law enforcement officials should not use kinetic impact projectiles as a general tool to disperse a crowd. These weapons may only be used in extreme need to stop people who commit violence against other people. They're not committing violence, they're just demonstrating. Item 5. Because it's unlikely that these individuals can be hit accurately in a crowd, this weapon is unsuitable for firing at a crowd as a random shot. Moreover, these bullets must never bump against the ground, because that makes them even more inaccurate. 6. Kinetic impact projectiles fired with the rifle may only be fired at the target's chest or limbs and not at the head. They should only focus on the lower parts of the body to minimize injuries. 7. Before shooting, law enforcement officers must carefully evaluate the context to determine, as far as possible, that no one else can be hit, which is clearly not the case. They're just blazing away. And under international law, it must be ensured that they are not aimed at a vulnerable person, for example, someone who is injured, pregnant, or has a disability. 8. Because the above conditions cannot be met in the context of the Yellow Vest demonstrations, Amnesty International asked the French Minister of the Interior to immediately suspend the use of the LBD-40 projectiles. Now, France is the only country in the European Union that uses GLI F4 instant tear gas shells during law enforcement operations. Funny that, isn't it? However, these cause such serious injuries that the lives of those affected are dramatically changed. Point 9. Chemical irritants such as tear gas may only be used in extreme situations and only for the dispersion of a crowd. This is only when the levels of violence is such that law enforcement officials cannot control the threat by focusing directly on the violent individuals. 10. The purpose of using tear gas, as stated, should be to disperse the crowd, not fired at people. And they should therefore only be used in areas where people have the opportunity to spread, and not in confined spaces or where roads are blocked, funny enough, by police, or restricted. And clear, audible warnings must be given before they are used, and people must have sufficient time to leave the area. Amnesty International also urges the Minister of Interior to prohibit the use of the tear gas grenades for public order situations that are exposing people to the effects of tear gas and not allowing them to escape immediately, as well as potentially causing life-altering injuries, should be considered an excessive use of force and could lead to cruel and inhumane treatment. Weapons with such combined effects must therefore be banned in public order. Their 12th recommendation is the French authorities must strive for de-escalation and pacification in order to maintain order, which means you don't go pushing protesters in the face or hitting them with batons for no apparent reason, as we've witnessed on several videos. And these weapons can not only cause serious damage but lead to an escalation of violence, which is what they're trying to do, from where they're goading the demonstrators into attacking them so they can fire at them. You know, we've all got eyes, we can all see what's going on. And this can ultimately deter many people from protesting peacefully, jeopardising the right to peaceful manifestation and expression. Now, the French government and the judiciary there are sticking to the violent policy. Well, it's up to the countries, leaders of other countries, to turn around and call them out that this is not acceptable levels of police in that situation. Clearly it's not. Mr. Trump should speak up. I don't care whether Macron's his pal or whoever else. It's not acceptable to treat your public in that manner. Now, various organisations and initiatives have already attempted to prohibit the use of these controversial weapons. Back in 2017, the French Ombudsman appealed to ban these projectiles during maintenance of demonstrations. This was a year before the Yellow Vest demonstrations had started. Back in February of this year, the Commissioner for the European Council of Human Rights made an urgent appeal to the French Ministry of the Interior to suspend these projectiles. And these urgent recommendations have been ignored by the Macron government. That's because nobody else is calling them out, that's why. Where's the UN in this? Aren't they supposed to get involved in situations like this? Supposed to, and what happens is a completely different reality. Now, at the end of January, neurosurgeon Laurent Thines launched a petition against the use of LBD projectiles, and 80,000 people signed the petition in about 2 weeks, and more than 173,000 people have now signed the petition. Now, back on the 6th of February, a summary judgment proceedings at the Council of State was filed by the Human Rights League for a ban on the use of these LBD projectiles, and the request was rejected. That means they knew they were going to use them. All staged, you see. On the 14th of February, a resolution was submitted in the European Parliament on the right to protest peacefully and the proportional use of force. Now, specific terms that could indicate to the controversial weapons or French situation were taken from the final text. Removed. Again, suggests there was interference and they knew they were going to use them. Moreover, that adopted resolution was not binding either. Now, during a hearing on April 3rd, 6 human rights organisations asked the French Council of State to have the use of the LBD projectiles banned by the Constitutional Court during the Yellow Vest demonstrations. However, the Council of State ruled that the law already provided for the use of weapons in case of absolute necessity and in strictly proportioned way. And yet we all have eyes and have seen that that is clearly not the case in almost every single incident. So far, all these initiatives have not led to an adapted police policy and the banning of controversial weapons. Will the recent Amnesty International report change that? We'll see. But explosive shells and the LBD-40 are classified as war materials under French law. So what they're stating is the French government and police have gone to war against the people. And the use of these weapons and their intensive use in recent months and years raises the question of law enforcement practices decided by the French authorities. Now, there's a further report of French police of having psychopathic traits. And the Amnesty International, whilst it does not explicitly discuss the aggressive and offensive behaviour of the military police and the BAC civilian units in the report, even without the use of tear gas grenades and the LBD-40 rifles, there has been excessive violence against the predominantly peaceful demonstrators. Excessive use of the baton can also lead to serious injury, and there are countless examples on social media that protesters who are already lying on the ground are being completely beaten. Again, we've all got eyes. The policemen and the BAC militias have been seen throwing stones and even carrying hammers. And the question remains, what does this have to do with law enforcement? Police carrying hammers? Witnesses report that the police are already deliberately steering for a conflict. Yes, we've all seen them in the videos with the demonstrators, and then escalating the violence. That's exactly what they're doing. And the excessive violence is not curbed or punished by the authorities, and the officers seem to be above the law. Well, they're not above people's law. And one day the people are going to snap. It'll happen in one country and it will escalate. This show has warned several times to the police forces around the world, if you continue to beat the public, one day they'll beat you back. And it will spread. The people have had enough of your control system, and they've had enough of your violence, and they've had enough of you protecting the system that works against all people, including yourselves. You are beyond stupid. I don't care who makes the orders. You've got your own brain to decide what is right and what is wrong, and what you are doing is clearly wrong in everyone's eyes. To protect what? The system? Will they protect you if you get beaten up or worse, killed? Nope. Why do we? Why don't you down weapons? All of it. And join in with the protesters and send a message to the system. We're not playing your games anymore. Why are you putting your own lives at risk? You're not doing your job. That's not part of an everyday job. Shooting people in the head. A different approach is needed. All this is not going to change by banning certain weapons. The police and civilian units are incited from above to take hard action against the demonstrators, but it doesn't mean to say you have to follow orders. If it's wrong, it's wrong. Beating pensioners over the head with batons. Hope your family's proud of you doing that. Because nobody else is. And in this way, the freedom of expression and the right to manifest itself is compromised clearly. And Amnesty International therefore not only calls for an immediate end for the use of war weapons, such as to preserve the physical integrity of individuals, but also emphasises France's obligation to guarantee an environment that enables everyone to express his opinion peacefully. You clearly failed. In addition to the information about the yellow vests, there's another portion or side to this. Since January the 1st, there have been 29 suicides amongst French police officers. Oops. One suicide every 4 to 5 days, according to the police union. And there are also related to 240 legal investigations in regards to police violence that are taking place currently. Like I said, all of you know what's right and all of you know what's wrong. Nobody has to die. If you don't police it, get the policy makers out. Put Macron out in the street to police it. Let's see how far it goes then. Drag the Congress or whatever, Parliament out. Put them on. Right on the spot in front of the protesters. Let's see if they'll police it. Why should you? Why should you, as a police commissioner, risk your officers? 29 dead this year. For what purpose? They won't protect you. Non-violent protests are twice as likely to succeed as armed conflicts. And those engage in a threshold of 3.5% of the population have never failed to bring about change. I'll repeat that again. Non-violent protests are twice as likely to succeed as armed conflicts, and those engaging requires a threshold of 3.5% of the population has never failed when it's reached that level to bring about change. 3.5%. Now, is there examples of this? Back in 1986, millions of Filipinos took to the streets of Manila in a peaceful protest and prayer in the People Power movement. The Marcos, Mr. Pindar, regime folded on the 4th day. Back in 2003, the people of Georgia ousted Eduard Shevardnadze through the bloodless Rose Revolution, in which protesters stormed the Parliament building holding the flowers in their hands. Not guns or weapons or rubber bullets or tear gas. Flowers. Earlier this year, the presidents of Sudan and Algeria both announced they would step aside after decades in office, thanks to peaceful campaigns of resistance. Remember Gandhi? He got everyone to just down tools. It ended the Raj. In each case, civilian resistance by ordinary members of the public trumped the political elite to achieve radical change. There are, of course, many ethical reasons to use non-violent strategies, but compelling research by a political scientist at Harvard University confirms the fact that civil disobedience is not only the moral choice, but it's also the most powerful way of shaping world politics by a long way. Non-violent protests. I remember a former resident of my hometown saying that. We'll have that now. We'll be back shortly.